Picture this. You are strapped into a titanium capsule, roughly the size of the front seat of a classic Volkswagen Beetle. You are hundreds of miles above the Earth, moving at 17,000 miles per hour in the absolute silent void of space. And suddenly, your entire world is spinning violently. You are doing one complete revolution every single second, a physically and biologically devastating rate of rotation. Through your tiny window, the sun is flashing like a strobe light. Blinding light, pitch black, blinding light, pitch black. The G-forces are physically pinning you into your seat, pulling the blood completely away from your brain. Your vision is starting to narrow into a dark tunnel, and the instrument panels in front of you are just a blurred, unreadable mess of dials and switches. You literally cannot focus your eyes. You are seconds, maybe mere moments away from blacking out completely. If you black out, you die, because your spacecraft will eventually tear itself apart from the sheer centrifugal force. It is the absolute definition of a nightmare scenario. But this is not the glorious Apollo 11 moon landing. This is March 1966. This is Gemini 8, and the man in the commander's seat fighting off unconsciousness, trying to diagnose a catastrophic mechanical failure in his own ship while being spun like a human centrifuge, is Neil Armstrong. Most highly trained military test pilots would simply succumb to the sheer panic or the overwhelming physiological forces in that moment, because you literally cannot see straight. Yet, what happens in those few terrifying minutes essentially proved to NASA that this specific man operated on a completely different psychological wavelength, genuinely possessing ice water in his veins. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. We all know the iconic photograph of the boot print in the gray lunar dust. But our mission today is to unpack the entirely complex, deeply misunderstood life of Neil Armstrong. We are looking way beyond the spacesuit to understand the architecture of his mind. An unparalleled aeronautical engineer, a grieving father, a decorated combat veteran, and ultimately, a very reluctant global icon. If you want to dive deep into the raw, unvarnished history of the figures who shaped our world, make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video. We have synthesized declassified historical logs, raw NASA mission transcripts, comprehensive biographies, and highly detailed post-mission engineering analyses to bring you this complete picture. To truly understand how a human being can manually land a spacecraft on the moon with literally seconds of fuel left, or survive that terrifying blinding spin in Gemini 8, we must look at how his brain was wired from childhood. We have to examine the crucible that forged him. Neil Alden Armstrong was born in August 1930, right at the onset of the Great Depression, in a rural area near Wapakoneta, Ohio. His father, Stephen, was an auditor for the Ohio state government. Because of the nature of that job during the Depression, auditing county records all across the state, the family was constantly being uprooted. By the time Neil was 14 years old, the family had moved 16 different times across various small towns in Ohio. Imagine what that perpetual movement does to a developing kid. You are perpetually the new kid in school. You never get the luxury of settling into a comfortable, static social circle. And you don't get deeply attached to places or groups because you know you're just going to leave in a few months anyway. You have to learn to be highly observant, highly adaptable, and self-reliant, building an internal world because your external world just keeps shifting around you, keeps within that highly transient, unpredictable lifestyle. He found a profound, singular anchor: aviation. It started incredibly early, when he was just 5 or 6 years old, and his father took him to the Cleveland air races. His dad paid for them to take a joyride in a Ford tri-motor airplane, the famous Tin Goose. These old planes had a distinctive corrugated metal skin, like a tin roof wrapped around a fuselage, operating as loud, rattling, visceral machines. Being a 5-year-old kid in 1936, stepping inside this vibrating metal tube and feeling the raw mechanical power of those 3 massive radial engines shaking his bones as they lifted off the grass and defied gravity, completely rewired his brain. From that moment, flight became an absolute obsession, but not a romantic one. He wasn't looking up at the clouds and daydreaming like a poet. He looked at the sky and saw a mechanical puzzle. This relentless logic became the defining trait of his entire life. By the time he was 9 years old, he wasn't just gluing together standard balsa wood models from a hobby shop. He went way beyond that by actually building a functional wind tunnel in the basement of his house. A 9-year-old boy in the 1930s built a testing facility using an old fan, scrap wood, and whatever materials he could scavenge around the neighborhood. He wanted to test the aerodynamic properties of the model planes he was designing, running fluid dynamics experiments to physically measure lift and drag before he was even in high school. This is the absolute blueprint of a systems engineer's mind taking shape, approaching flight not as magic, but as a strict mathematical and mechanical equation that had to be balanced. He didn't waste any time transitioning from models to real cockpits, working odd jobs at a local pharmacy and a grocery store just to pay for flying lessons at a dirt airstrip outside of town. He earned his student pilot's license on his 16th birthday, meaning he could legally take an airplane into the sky before he was legally allowed to drive a car down the street. For him, the ground was simply a place you waited until you could get back in the air. His trajectory remained laser-focused as he entered Purdue University in 1947 to study aeronautical engineering. His education was made possible by the Holloway Plan, a brilliant post-World War II Navy scholarship program designed to build a highly educated naval aviation corps. The military realized that the next generation of complex jet aircraft would require pilots who deeply understood engineering. The deal was simple. The Navy pays for 2 years of college tuition. Then you leave college for intensive flight training and serve as a naval aviator on active duty for 3 years, after which they pay for your final 2 years of the degree. This meant his college experience was violently interrupted by the start of the Korean War. Called up in 1949 and sent to Pensacola for flight training, by 1951, he was a fully commissioned ensign, flying combat missions straight into the fire off the pitching deck of the aircraft carrier USS Essex. He flew the Grumman F-9F Panther, a straight-wing jet fighter that served as the workhorse of the Navy's fleet. Over the course of his deployment, Armstrong flew 78 combat missions, involving armed reconnaissance, bomber escort, and incredibly dangerous heavy ground attack runs. He was awarded the Air Medal and 2 gold stars for his service. But the true origin story of his legendary coolness under fire occurred in the skies over North Korea. He was on a low-level bombing run, strafing ground targets, when disaster struck. Flying incredibly low is already perilous due to the terrain and ground fire, but the North Koreans had strung thick anti-aircraft cables across the valley, specifically to catch low-flying American jets. Traveling at roughly 500 miles an hour, his jet clipped one of these cables, and the impact literally sheared off about 6 feet of his right wing. You are in a metal tube, flying at 500 miles an hour, hundreds of feet off the ground, and suddenly, a massive chunk of your right wing is gone. In physics, this is an aerodynamically catastrophic event, and usually an immediate death sentence. Airplanes fly because wings generate lift. Losing 6 feet of a wing creates instant asymmetrical lift, where the left wing pushes up hard and the right wing loses its upward push. The plane should have instantly snapped into a violent, uncontrollable roll and drilled itself right into the side of the mountain. Surviving required sheer brute force piloting and an instant terrifying calculation. Instead of panicking, he fought the controls, applying immense physical strength to the control stick to keep the horribly maimed aircraft level against the entire aerodynamic will of the machine. Wrestling with physics, he managed to guide this crippled, unbalanced jet out of the valley, climbed to altitude to give himself a safety margin, and somehow flew it all the way back into friendly territory over South Korea. Before the plane finally gave out, he safely ejected and parachuted down into a rice paddy. A 20-year-old kid has his wing sheared off, nearly crashes into a mountain at 500 miles an hour, wrestles a dying jet over hostile territory, parachutes into a war zone, and his reaction isn't to ask for a desk job. He simply got right back in another jet the next day. This reaction might border on psychopathic detachment to an observer, but it gets to the very core of his deeply pragmatic, relentlessly logical mindset. He didn't see it as a near-death experience. To him, the airplane was a machine. A component failed due to a hostile cable. He executed the correct emergency procedures. The procedures worked. He survived, and the mission continued. It was just input and output, not a personal brush with the Grim Reaper. There simply wasn't room in his mental architecture for the luxury of trauma, because the job required him to get back in the cockpit. So he got back in the cockpit. His brain was a fortress, surrounded by a similarly intense culture in his squadron, VF-51, the Screaming Eagles, which was so legendary that the classic novel, The Bridges of Tokori, was modeled directly after his unit. That combat-forged ability to treat extreme visceral danger as a math problem to be solved dictated his next chapter. He returned to Purdue to finish his degree in 1955, and the moment he graduated, he was scooped up by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the predecessor to NASA. He was officially a research test pilot, sent to the high-speed flight station at Edwards Air Force Base in the remote high desert of California. During the 1950s and 60s, Edwards was the absolute Wild West of aviation, pushing the envelope every single day to figure out how fast and how high humans could go before the machines melted or the pilots passed out. Armstrong flew over 200 different models of aircraft there, including jets, rockets, experimental gliders, and helicopters. The absolute crown jewel of his test pilot era was the North American X-15. It was a hypersonic rocket plane, essentially a missile so dangerous and fuel-hungry that it couldn't even take off from a runway. It had to be carried up into the air, strapped under the wing of a massive B-52 bomber like a bomb. At about 45,000 feet, the bomber dropped the X-15, and Armstrong would ignite the 500,000 horsepower rocket engine, blasting into the stratosphere at a near vertical trajectory, essentially trapping himself in a missile with a window. He flew the X-15 7 times, reaching speeds of nearly 4,000 miles per hour, roughly Mach 5.7, and altitudes over 200,000 feet. Flying at that incomprehensible height meant he was essentially in the vacuum of space, where conventional aerodynamic controls like flaps and rudders became entirely useless because the air was too thin to push against. To steer, he had to use reaction control thrusters, puffing little jets of hydrogen peroxide gas into the vacuum to pitch and roll the craft. He was no longer flying an airplane. He was flying a spacecraft. The margin for error on the way back down was essentially zero. If his re-entry angle into the thicker parts of the atmosphere was too steep, the friction from the air would literally melt the Inconel X titanium skin of the aircraft and incinerate him. If it was too shallow, He would skip off the atmosphere like a stone on a pond and bounce out into space with no fuel to come back. It required absolute pure engineering precision. But while his professional life was soaring to these literal new heights, his personal life was about to be struck by an unimaginable tragedy, a problem his brilliant mathematical mind was entirely powerless to fix. During his time at Edwards Air Force Base, he was married to his college sweetheart, Janet Sheeran, and they were building a life together with a young family. But in 1961, their beautiful 2-year-old daughter, Karen, was diagnosed with diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, or DIPG. This is an extremely aggressive malignant tumor located right in the middle of the brainstem. Even today, with all of our modern medical technology, the prognosis for DIPG is absolutely heartbreaking, and in the early 1960s, it was a swift and absolute death sentence. They tried whatever they could, including radiation treatments, but her health rapidly deteriorated. Because of where the tumor is, it attacks the body's core functions. Karen lost her ability to walk, and then her ability to speak. In January 1962, shortly after her second birthday, she passed away. For a man who built his entire life and identity on the premise that any problem could be solved, if you just understood the math, the mechanics, and the physics. This was a biological problem he was entirely powerless to fix. He had zero control over this tragedy, yet he did not process his grief by breaking down publicly, taking time off, or even really talking about it. Instead, Karen's memory became a profound, silent fuel for him. He processed his agony by applying himself to the most dangerous, highly focused, cognitively demanding work possible. Think of the design of a submarine or a spacecraft. These vessels are built with physical, heavy steel compartments called bulkheads. If one section takes catastrophic damage and starts flooding, the captain has to make a brutal decision to seal those heavy steel doors. It is an incredibly painful thing to do, but you isolate the flooding so that the rest of the vessel can stay pressurized, maintain buoyancy, and continue the mission. Emotionally, Armstrong sealed off the mental compartment that held that unbearable, suffocating grief so he could keep functioning. He compartmentalized the trauma because the spaceflight work he was transitioning into was completely unforgiving and demanded 100% of his cognitive capacity. He couldn't afford a single distraction. Shortly after her death, NASA announced they were looking for their second group of astronauts, and he immediately applied. Accepted into the new 9, he moved his family to Houston, Texas. NASA was entering a new phase where they didn't just need the military bravado-driven fighter jocks of the original Mercury 7 who could endure G-forces. They needed systems engineers with civilian research backgrounds who could fly in a vacuum. And they were about to need those deep engineering skills desperately. This brings us right back to the terrifying scenario of Gemini 8 in March 1966. The Gemini program was the vital, incredibly dangerous stepping stone between the single-man Mercury flights and the Apollo moon missions. Before going to the moon, humanity had to prove we could live in space for extended periods, maneuver, and most importantly, physically dock 2 spacecraft together in orbit. The entire plan for Apollo relied on the lunar orbit rendezvous concept, because you cannot land a massive spaceship on the moon. You have to detach a small lunar module, go down to the surface, blast back up, and redock with the command module waiting in orbit. Without reliable docking, Apollo is dead in the water, and we never go to the moon. Armstrong was selected as the commander of Gemini 8, flying alongside pilot Dave Scott. Their primary mission was to chase down an unmanned Agena target vehicle, a modified upper-stage rocket launched ahead of them. They had to find it in the vastness of space, match speeds at 17,500 miles an hour, and physically lock their capsule into its docking collar. This requires an incredibly complex, deeply counterintuitive orbital ballet. In orbital mechanics, if you just point your nose at a target and fire your engines to speed up, you do not catch them. Adding speed actually pushes your spacecraft into a higher, wider altitude, meaning you take longer to circle the Earth, and you fall behind. You have to perform a complex series of burns to drop below the target, into a faster, lower orbit, and then push up to meet it. Executing this absolute mathematical precision perfectly, Armstrong gingerly guided the nose of the tiny Gemini capsule into the docking collar of the massive Agena. The latches engaged, the docking light illuminated, marking the first ever docking of two spacecraft in human history. This massive triumph lasted a grand total of about 27 minutes. While entirely out of radio contact with ground tracking stations, long before continuous satellite communication relays, the combined Gemini-Agena stack suddenly began to violently yaw and roll. The purely logical deduction was that the big, dumb Agena rocket was malfunctioning, perhaps its attitude control system firing erratically. Armstrong used the Gemini's maneuvering thrusters to fight the roll, stabilizing it briefly. But the moment he stopped actively fighting, the roll violently started again. Burning through precious maneuvering fuel, they developed a bigger fear. The torsional forces might cause the Agena's fuel tanks to structurally rupture, causing an explosion that would vaporize them instantly. To save themselves, they made the only call they could and undocked. But the moment they separated from the Agena, the spinning didn't stop. It got drastically, exponentially worse. This was the terrifying law of conservation of angular momentum at play. Think of an Olympic ice skater spinning. With arms stretched wide, they spin relatively slowly. But the moment they pull their arms in tight against their chest, the mass is brought closer to the center of rotation, and their spin drastically accelerates into a blur. The combined mass of the Gemini and the heavy Agena was like the skater with extended arms. Once they jettisoned the heavy Agena, the same erratic thrust acted on just the tiny lightweight Gemini capsule. The spin rate accelerated dramatically, rotating at nearly 1 full revolution per second, almost 300 degrees a second. The physiological toll was horrifying. His inner ear screamed. Blood was pushed away from his brain, and his eyes exhibited nystagmus, jittering uncontrollably, trying to find a fixed point. They were seconds away from unconsciousness, and the sustained G-forces would eventually kill them. Bordering on passing out and blinded by the strobe of the sun, Armstrong's engineer's mind logically deduced the problem. It wasn't the Agena. It was their own ship. Specifically, roll thruster number 8 on the Gemini Orbital Attitude and Maneuvering System, or OAMS, had short-circuited. The electrical valve was stuck in the open position, continuously blasting fuel into the vacuum and spinning the craft like a pinwheel. Because there were no individual circuit breakers in the cockpit to isolate the bad thruster, he was forced into a split-second, incredibly high-stakes decision to completely shut down the entire OAMS system. Yet, in a vacuum without friction, the momentum kept them spinning at a lethal rate, even with the power off. To stop the spin, he had to activate the Re-entry Control System, or RCS, situated on the nose of the capsule. This was a massive mission-ending deal, operating on separate plumbing. The absolute sole purpose of the RCS was to keep the blunt heat shield pointed forward during the fiery re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere. Flight rules explicitly stated that if you tap into the RCS fuel for any reason while in orbit, the mission must be immediately aborted, because if you run out, your capsule will tumble during re-entry, and you will literally burn up like a meteor. With no choice between aborting or dying in orbit, he killed the OAMS, fired the RCS, physically fought the spin using the hand controller and agonizingly stabilized the spacecraft, using 75% of their vital re-entry fuel just to stop the tumbling. They executed emergency abort procedures, splashing down in the western Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles away from their primary recovery zone. Dave Scott later summarized the awe of that moment. The guy was brilliant. He knew the system so well. He found the solution. It was my lucky day to be flying with him. Gemini 8 is not as universally famous as Apollo 13 because there was no prolonged drama or live broadcast of a team of engineers building a carbon dioxide scrubber over 3 days. Gemini 8 was over almost as soon as it began, out of radio contact. Armstrong had to diagnose an electrical short circuit while spinning at blinding speed, entirely alone in the dark. But within NASA, it proved to mission planners like Deke Slayton that Armstrong was the ultimate unflappable crisis manager. He further cemented this legendary resilience in 1968, surviving a terrifying explosion in the lunar landing training vehicle, known as the Flying Bedstead. It was an incredibly unstable, jet-powered contraption designed to simulate the lunar module's flight characteristics on Earth. During a test flight, a propellant system failed. The vehicle went completely out of control, and Armstrong ejected mere seconds before it smashed into the ground in a fireball. His reaction? He parachuted down, bit his tongue on landing, walked back to his office, and just sat at his desk to do paperwork. It was absolute compartmentalization. He nearly died in a fireball and just caught up on filing. This exact resilience made him the obvious choice to command the mission that would attempt the actual moon landing, Apollo 11, the technological climax of the 20th century. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V rocket launched, generating 7.5 million pounds of thrust in a sheer auditory and physical violence that is beyond modern comprehension. The medical telemetry from the crew on the launch pad was fascinating. While Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin had heart rates around 88 to 99 beats per minute, Armstrong's was sitting at 110. Flight surgeons knew this wasn't fear. It was an extreme state of cognitive arousal, an immense dialed-in focus as he prepared his body and mind for the descent. But as they separated from the command module and began their powered descent to the lunar surface, dropping through 33,500 feet, the master alarms started blaring, threatening to turn the culmination of a decade of intense national effort into a catastrophic failure. Almost immediately, at 33,500 feet above the desolate gray lunar surface, the alarms began to shriek. Inside the tiny cabin of the lunar module, the Eagle, a yellow warning light illuminated the cramped space, and a master alarm sounded. On the digital display of their primitive computer, a cryptic code flashed, 1202, followed moments later by 1201. Dropping toward the moon in a machine with paper-thin walls, relying entirely on a rudimentary system to guide their descent engine, you could hear a slight, uncharacteristic edge of urgency in Armstrong's voice as he radioed Houston, "Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm." To grasp the terror of this moment, you must understand the Apollo guidance computer, an absolute marvel of software engineering developed largely under the guidance of Margaret Hamilton and her team at the MIT Instrumentation Laboratory. Its memory hardware used something called core rope memory. It wasn't burned onto a silicon chip like today. It was literally woven by hand by female textile workers in factories. They threaded copper wires through or around tiny magnetic rings. If the wire went through, it was a 1. If it went around, it was a 0. They physically knitted the software code, creating an incredibly robust system that could not be erased by radiation or power loss. But its processing capacity was severely limited. The 1202 alarm was caused by radar data overload. Buzz Aldrin had left the rendezvous radar turned on, per his checklist, as a safety precaution, in case they needed to immediately abort the landing and chase down the command module. This created a hardware mismatch, where the computer was simultaneously trying to process altitude data from the landing radar pointing at the ground, and positional data from the rendezvous radar pointing at the sky. It was receiving far too much sensory input. Imagine driving on a complicated highway interchange, relying on your smartphone's GPS for critical turn-by-turn directions, while in the background, the phone attempts to download a massive software update, sync your entire photo library to the cloud, and play a high-definition video. A badly designed phone would simply freeze and crash, leaving you blind on the highway. But Hamilton's team brilliantly designed the computer to prevent a catastrophic crash. The 1201 and 1202. Alarms were executive overflow warnings. The machine intelligently recognized it was maxing out, so it actively dropped lower priority background tasks, like the unnecessary rendezvous radar data, to dedicate all processing power to the absolute most critical tasks of keeping the landing engine firing and the guidance system stable. Armstrong and Aldrin didn't know the deep software architecture of this executive overflow in that exact moment. They just saw a blaring master alarm during the most dangerous phase of flight. But back in Mission Control in Houston, a 26-year-old computer whiz named Jack Garman and a guidance officer named Steve Bales recognized the code. They only knew it because of a brutal simulation run just 11 days prior by a tough simulation supervisor named Richard Coos, whose job was to torture flight controllers with failure scenarios. Coos had thrown a 1201 alarm at them in practice. Bales had aborted the simulated landing, and Coos had ripped into them during the debriefing, forcing them to study exactly what those specific alarms meant. Because of that grueling training, Bales and Garman knew the computer was still flying the ship, and they confidently relayed the call. "We're go on that alarm." They pressed on, but as they got closer to the surface, Armstrong looked out his tiny triangular window and saw a terrifying new physical problem. The automated computer, completely blind to the terrain, was flying them perfectly into a massive crater surrounded by boulders the size of cars. This was West Crater. If the Eagle landed there, it would strike a boulder and tip over, meaning the ascent engine could not fire correctly, and they would be marooned on the moon to die with no rescue ship. In that heart-stopping instant, the systems engineer seamlessly shifted back into the combat fighter pilot. Armstrong clicked off the automated guidance and took manual control of the attitude and translation thrusters. He stopped their vertical drop and started flying the lunar module horizontally, almost like a helicopter, skimming over the deadly boulder field to find a smooth patch of dust. But hovering consumes precious time, and in spaceflight, time equals fuel. Mission Control Capcom. Charlie Duke called out the agonizing bingo fuel warnings. 60 seconds, and then 30 seconds. This meant Armstrong had less than half a minute to either touch down safely or hit the abort button, drop the descent stage, and fire the ascent engine to abandon the landing entirely. The pressure was unimaginable. The culmination of a decade of intense national effort, billions of dollars, and the hopes of the entire world rested on his shoulders. His heart rate spiked to 150 beats per minute under the immense physical stress, yet his voice on the radio remained absolute ice. Fascinatingly, post-mission engineering analysis revealed a pure physics problem regarding that fuel gauge. Mission Control truly believed they had 15 to 30 seconds of fuel left based on a sensor inside the tank. But because Armstrong was flying horizontally, pitching and rolling the craft in the 1/6 gravity of the moon, the liquid propellant sloshed back and forth like water in a bucket. The tanks lacked the sophisticated anti-slosh baffles installed on later missions, so the fluid sloshed away from the sensor, prematurely uncovering it and triggering the low fuel warning early. Post-flight calculations of the tank weights revealed they actually had a vital cushion of between 45 to 60 seconds of fuel remaining. Finally, he found a smooth spot. The lunar contact light illuminated, and the engine shut down. Then came the words that shifted human history forever. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. In mission control, the agonizing tension broke, with Charlie Duke replying, "You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again." It was a feat of unparalleled cognitive load, master piloting skill, and pure, unadulterated nerve. They spent 2.5 hours on the surface, collecting 47.5 pounds of lunar rocks, and left behind a silicon disk with messages of peace, an American flag, and deeply poignant for Armstrong, a mission patch honoring the Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, who had died in a horrific launchpad fire 2 years earlier. And then, the legendary quote, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." For years, controversy lingered over whether he forgot the A before man due to nerves, which would redundantly mean mankind twice. However, an Australian computer programmer named Peter Shanford later ran the raw audio through advanced digital acoustic reprocessing and found the missing A. It had simply been swallowed by the static, his Midwestern accent, and the transmission limitations of 1960s radio technology perfectly clearing his name. Armstrong had engineered his way out of every crisis the universe threw at him, landing the impossible machine. But returning to Earth brought a challenge he couldn't fly his way out of, a problem he couldn't fix with an RCS thruster or a math equation. He came back to a world that had fundamentally changed how it viewed him, beginning the final chapter of his life as the reluctant icon. The contrast between the monumental public achievement and the intensely private man was striking. After a grueling global goodwill tour, which he viewed merely as a duty to his country, the paths of the Apollo 11 crew diverged sharply. While Buzz Aldrin largely embraced the spotlight, writing best-selling books and becoming a vocal public advocate, Armstrong completely retreated from the glare of celebrity. In 1971, he quietly resigned from NASA and accepted a job as a professor of aerospace engineering at the University of Cincinnati. He chose them over his alma mater, Purdue, specifically because Cincinnati had a smaller aerospace department where he hoped to blend in. He desperately wanted to be treated as a peer, not a living myth or a trophy professor. He even removed his name from his office door so students wouldn't gawk at him in the hall, wishing only to stand at a chalkboard and teach fluid dynamics and aeronautics to the next generation. But the world simply couldn't accept that the first man on the moon just wanted to grade papers. The intrusions into his life became bizarre and deeply unsettling. He had to stop signing autographs entirely because people were forging them and selling them for massive profits, a direct violation of his deep sense of ethics. The most egregious violation came from his own trusted local barber, who secretly collected Armstrong's hair clippings off the floor and sold them to a collector for $3,000. Offended by the profound violation of privacy, Armstrong actually sued the man, highlighting the immense psychological toll of fame on an introverted engineer who never asked to be a global hero. When he was called back into public service, it was never for parades, but for solemn analytical duties, such as serving as the vice chairman on the Rogers Commission investigating the tragic Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986, where he provided the cold, clear-eyed engineering analysis The nation desperately needed to understand the O-ring failure. Privately, things were difficult. Friends noted severe bouts of depression, and the emotional distance and compartmentalization that had saved his life in Korea helped him survive the loss of his daughter and pushed him through the terror of Gemini 8, began to take a heavy toll on his marriage. He and Janet divorced in 1994 after decades together. He did eventually find peace later in life, remarrying a woman named Carol and living quietly in Ohio until he passed away on August 25, 2012, at the age of 82, following complications from cardiovascular surgery. In a final, fitting tribute to his blueprint, he was not buried in Arlington National Cemetery with massive state fanfare. Instead, he requested to be buried at sea, honoring his humble roots as a naval aviator. Was it a tragedy that he couldn't fully enjoy his status as a global hero? Or was it a profound testament to his integrity that he absolutely refused to cash in on it? It aligns perfectly with what his Apollo 11 crewmate, Michael Collins, said when asked to summarize his legacy. Collins didn't talk of bravery or destiny. He simply said, "Good decisions all the way." Armstrong lived by a strict internal code of service, technical accomplishment, and deep modesty, doing the job he was assigned perfectly. For millennia, humanity looked at the moon as a realm of poetry, a playground for gods and mythic heroes. But Neil Armstrong looked at the moon and saw a complex mathematical equation of fluid dynamics, orbital mechanics, and fuel constraints. His legacy isn't merely the courage to go. His legacy is proving that human reason, meticulous engineering, and cold, calm logic could conquer the literal heavens. Redefining heroism in the modern age, not as swagger, but as supreme competence. The reality of a legendary life is murky, filled with the silent trauma of a lost child, the terror of a sheared wing over a foreign valley, and the chaotic sloshing of fuel in a tin can 250,000 miles from home. Neil Armstrong navigated those muddy, terrifying waters, not with ego, but with the quiet, relentless precision of an engineer who refused to let the machine fail. He was the ultimate pilot for the ultimate mission. If you were moved by the true, complex story behind this monumental leap for mankind, please consider subscribing to Legendary Lives Unveiled, leaving a comment below with your thoughts on his profound stoicism, and sharing this video to keep history's greatest stories alive.